The second answer, or the second intervention in the debate around Anthropocene, which I find very interesting, is one by Native American scholar and activist Nick Estes, who in his book Our History is the Future has argued that very often in Europe, the debate around Extinction Rebellion, our extinction as a species, apocalyptic thought, apocalyptic films, and so on, has centered around a very Eurocentric, a bourgeois white positionality of what it means for the world to end. He asks, whose world is ending? Whose world has already ended multiple times, as is the case, he argues, for many native peoples on Turtle Island, North America, South America, as indeed in much of the rest of the world. Frederick Jameson famously stated a couple of decades ago that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. The anthropologists David Valentine and Nick Estes, in his book, both responded with a similar critique. Whose world is being talked about here? Whose apocalypse? In the book, Our History is the Future, Indigenous activist and historian Nick Estes argues that for the Lakota, as for most Indigenous people on Turtle Island, there have been many apocalypses through mass murder, through smallpox, broken treaties, through the tragedies of reservation life, the ongoing massacres way into the 19th and indeed the 20th century, the theft of lands, the theft of children, extinct languages, and extinct futures. If there is anything then that the new climate movements and their whiteness can learn from the Lakota, one could extrapolate from his argument, it is how to resist extractive, capitalist, settler colonialist expansions in a post-apocalyptic world. So the extinction is not yet to come, but it has already arrived for so many people around the world. And this kind of critique was seen in praxis in the Standing Rock mobilizations, among other indigenous forms of resistance against, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline a few years ago, which they successfully defeated in many parts of Turtle Island. What is also interesting is that a lot of these mobilizations do not think in national terms, also because these nation state boundaries were drawn by settler colonialist and colonialist projects. So, for example, the line was drawn across the United States and Canada, whereas the First Nations exist across these boundaries. We also see examples in the Wet'suwet'en lands where indigenous activists have resisted colonial forms of encroachment upon lands by using metaphors of care. So, for example, they're the water protectors and so on. There are indeed many, many lessons which I cannot go into in detail to be learned from indigenous activists who have been not just fighting climate change, and not just fighting for environmental causes, but for whole-scale ecological, anti-colonial possibilities of human existence. And these are intergenerational examples that one could learn a great deal from. Indeed, indigenous and racialized communities have mobilized resistance and utopic solutions on a planetary scale even before the term social movement, or Soziale Bewegung in German, was invented. As the anthropologist Theodoros Rakopoulos has argued in a recent book, austerity, or in German Sparpolitik, is just a Eurocentric term to describe that which the majority world, that is the global south, had suffered under the neo-colonial structural adjustment policies of the International Monetary Fund. If we take this idea seriously, then we can actually see that a lot of the global processes, like Aimé Césaire and others of the Negritude movement have taught us, which were first implemented on colonized peoples in the global south, have now come to haunt the edges of Europe and proletarian populations across Europe, for example, as we have seen in Greece and Portugal and elsewhere. So if we take these questions seriously and these ideas that we actually have a lot to learn from movements which have a wider scope of activism and which come from a place of anti-colonial resistance and not just addressing a small fix in the system, we might ask the young and sometimes not young protesters and activists as part of the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion and Ende Gelände movements, what is your relationship to the Standing Rock protesters, to the protesters in Mauna Kea, in the colonized lands of Hawaii, in Bolivia, protesting German mining companies who have signed new contracts since the recent developments, and so on and so on? What is your relationship to these intergenerational, long-standing traditions of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist resistance under colonialist capitalist regimes?